When a bird loved a human, love beyond lifetimes. In a poor countryside blanketed with red dust and the hoarse cries of birds echoing across thatched roofs, there stood a small house at the edge of a forest. Made of clay and straw, the house looked like it might collapse at the first turn of monsoon wind. There lived an old, kind man with his 3 sons. No one in the village called him by name anymore. They simply referred to him with reverence as the man of Allah or the morning ascetic, because he always rose before dawn to pray and quietly tend the garden. His late wife had been a gentle woman, always reminding the children to be grateful and patient. She died during a strange illness that swept through the village, leaving behind a silent grief that settled like dust. Her absence left not only a void in the cold clay home, but also in the hearts of her husband and 3 sons, 3 boys she once called the threads that bind my soul. The eldest, Roshan, was tall, strong, and proud. The second, Samir, was quiet and often calculating. The youngest, Ahmed, was small in stature but the only one who truly inherited their father's compassionate heart. Ahmed worked tirelessly, but also listened to the wind in the leaves and the rain on the roof, as if it whispered prayers not yet spoken. Each morning, they worked the fields together. Some days they harvested corn, other days they cleared brush. Life was unchanging, poor, simple, but peaceful. Poverty, to outsiders, was hardship. But to their father, it was just a temporary garment of human life, and he always taught, a man is only truly poor when he loses his faith. Time passed, and the 3 boys grew up. The 2 older ones went off with friends to work for wealthy landlords in other villages. They began to wear fine clothes, eat meat with every meal, and secretly scoff at the old prayers their father still recited. Only Ahmed stayed behind, still sweeping the yard, splitting firewood, and praying with his father under the flicker of candlelight. Many nights, the old man would sit by an oil lamp, watching Ahmed doze off over an open Quran, and think, this son not only obeys but loves in the right way. Not from duty, but from compassion. Then one day, during a quiet moment of meditation as fine rain fell beyond the clay-framed window, the father called his sons together. His voice was raspy, but each word seemed etched into the marrow of their bones. I have lived long enough to know that death can arrive with a single breath. You have grown. Before I leave this world, I wish to see each of you begin a home of your own. But I am too old now. I cannot knock on doors to seek brides as your mother once did. You must find your own fate. Roshan and Samir exchanged glances. He said nothing but frowned slightly. Ahmed kept his head bowed, his eyes bright in the candlelight. But father, Ahmed said softly, if you wish, I will wait as long as it takes and go wherever I must to find the one. Please, help me choose. The father smiled a bittersweet smile, full of gratitude and something like sorrow. No, Ahmed. I no longer have the strength. But there is a way. Go behind the house, each of you. Take an axe, and cut a branch from the old tree. Wherever your branch falls, that is the direction in which you must go to find your life partner. Let fate guide you. Roshan burst out laughing. A branch to decide our fate? That's ridiculous. But still, all 3 brothers walked behind the house. The setting sun cast golden orange light across the moss-covered trunk of the ancient tree. Roshan went first. His branch fell south, toward a wealthy village. Samir followed. His branch fell right within their own village where a girl he'd long admired lived. Then came Ahmed. The branch he cut, slender but firm, fell toward the deep forest. A forest said to be haunted by spirits and ruled by tigers. Roshan laughed. Looks like our little brother is marrying a tiger." But Ahmed didn't laugh. He bowed his head and whispered, "If that is my fate, then I'm not afraid." Their father watched him with moist eyes. "Go, my son. But remember, those who love with trust in their hearts will always find what is meant for them." And so, Ahmed packed a few belongings into a cloth bag, kissed his father goodbye, and stepped alone into the forest where destiny awaited in a form no one could have imagined. Ahmed entered the forest just as the last light of day melted into the horizon. The woods stretched before him like a heavy cloak of fate, silent, ancient, and full of unseen traps. Each step he took crunched over fallen leaves, echoing like whispers from the earth. Are you ready? If you're still watching this video and willing to walk this mysterious path with Ahmed, drop a number 2 in the comments below so I know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to hit that button and ring the bell. Your support helps us continue making inspiring and meaningful content for you. Tree shadows stretched long, the old forest like a gathering of silent elders guarding their eternal sleep. No birds sang. No wind stirred. The forest held its breath. Ahmed was unafraid. He carried only a small cloth bag with his father's old Quran and some dried food. But within him burned something more precious, the belief that where light lives in the heart, no real darkness can stay. After walking a while, darkness fully swallowed the path. Ahmed felt along tree trunks, searching for shelter. Then, through the mist creeping silently across the ground, he saw a small hut nestled beneath the roots of a giant tree. There were no lights. No chimney smoke. But something waited. He knocked. No answer. He pushed the door open. Inside the modest hut stood a wooden table, a small window veiled with oilcloth, and a tiny, ash-colored bird perched on the window ledge, its round eyes reflecting the pale moonlight outside. The bird stared directly at Ahmed. And then, the strangest thing happened. "Welcome, traveler. I've been waiting for you." Ahmed froze. His heart nearly stopped. A bird, speaking. What are you? A demon? A spirit? The bird shook its head. "I was once human. And you're searching for something you don't yet understand." Its voice didn't echo like a human's but seemed woven from wind. Soft. Piercing. Yet oddly, it didn't frighten Ahmed. "My name is Ahmed," he replied steadily. "I came guided by fate." The branch fell toward the forest. "And I believe the one I'm meant to meet is here." The bird peered into his eyes deep, like it was searching through the corners of his soul. "And if the one you're meant to marry is me?" "A bird? Could you love a creature without a human form?" Ahmed smiled, a smile only those who have known true loss and unconditional love would understand. "If your heart knows the Quran, if your soul knows when to be still, then your form matters little." The bird was silent. Then suddenly, it leapt to the table and pulled out a small, old teapot. Somehow, with its tiny claws, it picked up dry leaves and blew a warm breath. Steam rose like smoke from untold dreams. "Tea for those who can see with the heart," the bird said. "Now, let me sing for you." Its song wasn't birdsong but a passage from the Quran, soft and flowing, like a cool stream across a burning desert. Ahmed closed his eyes. Tears slipped down his cheeks without warning. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly at peace. Who are you, really?" he asked when the chant ended. The bird's voice turned low, sorrowful. "I was once a girl. A believer in light. But cursed by darkness." Ahmed clenched his fists. He wanted to ask more. But the bird said just one thing. Ask no further. When the time comes, the truth will speak itself. That night, Ahmed slept inside the hut, his head resting against a straw-covered cloth, while the little bird sat atop the old tree, silently keeping watch over his dreams. Outside, the rain began to fall, each droplet tapping like the quiet knock of destiny at the door. A boy. A mysterious bird. And a beginning that neither the village nor fate itself could have ever imagined. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the vine-covered window, falling softly on the dusty wooden floor like a heavenly blessing. Ahmed awoke not from the light, but from a sound gentle as breath. The bird was reciting the Quran. It still sat at the windowsill, eyes half closed, immersed in a meditative trance. The chanting was not alone, there was something about the way it echoed, as though the entire forest was in silent prayer with it. The trees stood still, the leaves unmoved, even the clouds seemed frozen in reverence. Ahmed sat up, washed his face from the wooden pail outside, and returned quietly to kneel behind the bird, softly whispering the verses in unison. For the first time in his life, he no longer felt alone, even though his companion was merely a small creature with fragile wings. As the chant faded, the bird turned to him gently. "You didn't ask me yesterday whether any of this was real," it said. "You didn't even ask for my name." Ahmed smiled. "Because some questions can only be answered by time, not words." The bird nodded, its eyes shimmering like starlight in morning dew. "I once had a name, Nilam. But perhaps I no longer deserve a human name." "No," Ahmed replied softly. "If a soul can still recite sacred words and remain virtuous, no form can diminish its worth." That morning, Ahmed sat at the small wooden table, heart pounding with the truth he had carried all night. "Nilam," he said, "if you do not object, I want to marry you." The bird fell silent. Then it fluttered down and perched gently on Ahmed's open palm. Its tiny eyes welled with tears. "Do you understand what you're saying? I'm not human. I have no hair to braid, no hands to hold yours. I cannot bear children. I cannot weave cloth or cook meals." Ahmed softly cupped her delicate wings in his hands. "But you have something that hundreds of women outside this forest do not, the light within your heart." There was a long silence between them, between two souls so different in form. And then, the bird spoke. "Then from this moment forward I am your wife. If fate has chosen it, I do not resist." There was no wedding ceremony. No drums. No silk dress. No rings of gold. Just an old hut, a promise whispered deep in the forest, and two beings, one human, one bird, sharing tea, as if the entire universe had gathered in silent witness to a union unlike anything the world had ever known. If you're still watching this video and wish to bless Ahmed and his bride, comment 2 below to let me know you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend doing so and turning on the bell icon. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful, inspiring stories. That same afternoon, Ahmed returned to the village. His father smiled when he saw his youngest son return safely. His two brothers, however, couldn't suppress their laughter. "So, did you find a bride?" one teased. "Does she know how to husk rice?" the other joked. Ahmed simply smiled. "She knows how to recite scripture." The answer made both brothers pause. But only for a second, then they burst out laughing louder than before, as if they'd just heard the strangest joke in the world. That night, the father called his 3 sons together. His voice was gentle but firm. "I want each of you to bring me a piece of bread made by your wife. From that, I will know whether she is someone who can truly keep a home." Roshan and Samir left at once, confident. Ahmed stood still for a moment, then, as night fell, he put on his coat and walked silently back toward the forest. In the hut, Neelam was quietly reciting scripture. When she saw Ahmed, her wings touched the floor like a breath of wind. "You've come again." Ahmed nodded and explained his father's request. He hesitated. "I know, this is absurd. You're a bird. How could you possibly make bread?" Neelam didn't answer. She simply leapt down and rang a tiny bell hanging in the corner of the hut. Immediately, from tiny holes in the floor, dozens of mice emerged, bowing their heads in reverence. "You," she said, "gather the grain for me." The mice scurried off like warriors in a legend. Moments later, they returned, each carrying a gleaming, plump grain of rice. Neelam crushed the rice with her feet, pounded it into flour, and kneaded the dough with her wings. Every movement was strange, beautiful, like an ancient ritual unfolding in the dark. When the small round bread was finally baked on a hot stone slab, its fragrance filled the hut like a prayer woven in scent. Ahmed said nothing. He only bowed deeply as he received the bread, not just a token of love, but proof of the miracles that faith can bring. The next morning, the three sons offered their bread to their father. Roshan, his was large, beautiful, but cold. Samir, smaller, dry, and salty. Then came Ahmed. When he unwrapped the cloth, a small, white, fragrant loaf lay inside. It smelled of forest air, pure, clean, like a blessing whispered through trees. The father took the bread, closed his eyes, then opened them with a smile. "Your wife," he said, "is the keeper of the light." Ahmed never forgot those words. Ahmed's wedding day came in silence, just like the path he had chosen. No noise. No red banners. No garlands. No music. His father didn't object. He simply stared at Ahmed for a long time, then placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes carrying the weight of unsaid prayers. "If you choose love through trust, then your path is a righteous one." No one knew whom the groom would marry. His brothers still giggled behind his back, whispering, "Maybe Ahmed's marrying a parrot, or a stray cat." But Ahmed walked forward quietly, carrying a white scarf as a wedding gift, and in his pocket a ring passed down from his mother. No one followed. No one sent him off. Only the light shone quietly along the forest path, as if even the heavens knew that this was a sacred day. Inside the little hut beneath the ancient tree, Neelam was ready. She wore no wedding dress, but her wings were wrapped in soft white cloth. On her head, a crown made of dry leaves, woven with her own claws, simple, clean, untouched by the world. When Ahmed entered, she said, "I have nothing to give you. No dowry. No human form. Only a soul that has not shattered, and a heart that has never betrayed the sacred words." Ahmed knelt down and bowed deeply. "That," he whispered, "is the greatest gift anyone could ever receive." The officiant was an old monk who lived deep in the mountains, a longtime friend of Ahmed's father. He asked no questions. He simply looked at Neelam for a long time. When his eyes met her wings, something like light from another realm shimmered briefly, and he gave a subtle nod. The wedding took place in whispers of wind, in the rustle of forest leaves, and in the chirping of baby birds offering their blessings. No one bore witness, except a few squirrels, a young deer, and a passing breeze. And in the final moment, when the last prayer echoed, Neelam softly said, "The ceremony is complete. From now on, I will be the keeper of the flame within your heart, even if the winds of karma try to snuff it out." Right after the wedding, Neelam rang her tiny bell once more. The mice reappeared, obedient as though born solely to serve her. In moments, they built a wedding carriage from a dried walnut shell, pulled by the strongest mice among them. Neelam sat inside, draped in white cloth that covered her wings. Ahmed walked behind, not unlike a humble king trailing his quiet queen. Even if the world would never understand. As they exited the forest and approached the village, laughter was already waiting. His two older brothers burst out laughing. "This is the bride? A bird." Ahmed's lost his mind. Their wives chuckled too. "Poor thing. Couldn't find a human wife, so he brought home a bird." Neelam said nothing. She stood still, like a breath of wind. But her eyes were filled with quiet sorrow. Then the old father stepped forward. He looked at her deeply. And then he brought his hands together, bowed low. "Who are you?" he asked, who could make Ahmed smile with his whole heart. Neelam bowed in return. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In her nightly chanting, the old man had already heard the light. That night, after the household had fallen asleep, the old man woke in the stillness. Something soft and luminous stirred in the air. He stepped out onto the porch, prayer beads in hand. And there by the backyard he saw Neelam, reciting scripture. Not in birdsong, but in a human voice, clear, serene, deep. A woman's voice not of this world. The old man fell to his knees, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. "You're not a bird. You are a light that was once caged. And now, the light is free." The next morning, he gathered his 3 sons. "It's time to hold a wedding feast. I want the entire village to know that yesterday was sacred, not a joke." He gave Ahmed the responsibility to prepare everything. And for the first time, Neelam stepped out alongside her husband to the forest, to collect firewood. She still sat inside the walnut carriage. The white cloth covered her entirely, protecting the secret Ahmed wasn't ready to reveal. Neither of them knew a terrifying twist of fate awaited just around a bend in the trail. A stranger stood there. Tall. Heavy boots. Angry eyes. He blocked the path, staring at the strange carriage, then burst out laughing. "Oh? A wedding ride pulled by mice? And a bird for a bride?" Then with the cruelty only karma could explain, he kicked the carriage hard. There was a loud crack. The sound of mice squealing. The walnut shell carriage tumbled down into a rushing river. Ahmed screamed. "No!" But it was too late. The carriage shattered. Neelam, his wife, was gone, swept away by the current. The crash of water against rocks sounded like Ahmed's heartbeat breaking apart as he ran to the river's edge. The tiny walnut carriage lay in ruins like a dream crushed under daylight. The lead mouse was gone. The others too. There was no blood. No feathers. Just the current raging black like the pain flooding Ahmed's chest. "Neelam!" His scream tore the quiet forest in two. No reply. No birdsong. No tiny bell. Only the wind through leaves like the forest saying goodbye. If you're still watching this video and hoping for a miracle for Neelam, comment 8 below so I know you're here. If you haven't subscribed, I encourage you to do so and turn on the bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories that inform and inspire. Ahmed dropped to his knees by the river. His hands trembled as he clasped them in the air, tears flowing unchecked. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Neelam, where are you?" He didn't know how long he stayed like that. An hour? A lifetime? Until through the reeds on the opposite bank a figure appeared. It was a young woman. The setting sun lit her face like a fallen moon. Her hair was long, black as ink, tangled by wind. A dry leaf clung to her forehead, as though she had just risen from the earth, or another world. Ahmed was frozen. "Who are you?" he whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. The girl looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were moist, but steady. Then she spoke. "Don't you recognize me, Ahmed?" I don't. I'm Neelam. Your little bird." His whole body turned to stone. It couldn't be. But her eyes. The way she smiled, like a breeze on your skin. And most of all, that voice. The same one that had sung the holy verses each morning in the forest hut. "You, how?" Neelam stepped closer. No wings. No feathers. Just a girl whose eyes had seen both heaven and hell. "Do you remember what I told you? That I was once human? And cursed into a bird?" Ahmed nodded, lips unable to form words. "The curse broke, when the carriage shattered and I fell into the river. The current carried away the body of the bird and returned me to my true form." Who cursed you?" "A man who didn't believe in real love. A sorcerer. He wanted to possess me. I refused. So he turned me into something no one would dare to love." Ahmed clenched his fists. Blood seeped from where his nails dug into his palms. But he felt no pain. "And yet, you loved me. Even when I was just a bird who could chant scripture." Neelam smiled and stepped even closer. "No. You didn't just love me. You saved me." She reached out her hand, an actual human hand, warm, trembling slightly, holding an entire world of resurrection within it. Ahmed took it. He didn't cry. Tears could never express the wildfire burning in his chest. He only whispered, "Thank you, for coming back." The two of them walked through the blood-red glow of twilight, the wind tossing Neelam's hair across her shoulders. With every step, it was as if a note fell onto the symphony sheet of fate, each movement composing a melody no one had ever heard before. No one laughed when they returned to the village. No one called Neelam a bird anymore. For she was now Ahmed's true wife in human form, but carrying the same radiant light of a sacred soul. When the old father saw them pass through the gate, he choked on a single, trembling sentence. "This is a miracle only those who never lost faith are worthy to witness." That night, the village slept in peaceful silence. But in a small room tucked at the corner of the ascetic's garden, two people stayed awake. Ahmed leaned against the wooden pillar. Neelam sat across from him, her face flickering in the flame of a trembling oil lamp. She had just bathed. Her hair was still damp, scented faintly of forest leaves and warm ash. In her hand was a worn prayer bead strand, given not as a dowry, but as a sacred seal of invisible trust passed down by Ahmed's father. After a long silence, Neelam began to speak, not just with words, but as if pouring the autobiography of her soul through her gaze. "I was born into a poor but kind family. My father was the cleaner of an old mosque in the neighboring village. He never lectured on faith, but every action of his was a teaching. He once told me, 'Do not let your heart become stained with mud just because others step on it with dirty feet.' Her mother died young, from tuberculosis. Neelam grew up wearing an old scarf, her eyes studying the water's reflection to memorize every verse. By the age of 14, she was a Hafiz of the Quran, one who carries the entire sacred book in her heart and tears. Villagers called me a small light in the darkness of poverty. But that light drew the eyes of one who carried shadow. That man Neelam never spoke his name. He was a Hindu sorcerer, hailing from the blurred border between faith and manipulation. He arrived in her village pretending to be a gemstone trader. At first, He was just curious, asking questions. Then he gifted her family a bag of rice. One day, he gave Neelam a green parrot that could mimic human speech. Since I was little, I loved any creature that could speak. I believed that if something could form words, it meant it had a soul. That parrot was his first bait. She played with the parrot for a week. Then one day, it flew into the forest. She chased after it, and never returned, as an ordinary human again. The sorcerer blocked her path in the dense woods. He didn't use force. He used temptation. "I can make you a goddess," he whispered. "You only have to abandon your faith." Neelam refused. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th time he cursed her. Then becomes something no one dares to love. A bird. A soul that knows the Quran, but that no one will hear. And so, she became a grey bird trapped in a hut he built at the edge of the forest named Ganesha, once a sacred place for dark rituals by wandering Hindu mystics. Every day, I recited the Quran not for anyone, but to preserve the final memory of my mother, and the gaze of my father. I believed, if my prayers were pure enough, someone would hear them. And that person would recognize me, even if I no longer wore a human form. Neelam's eyes were no longer merely sad. They burned, as if her soul was reliving every cut of her past. Ahmed held her hand, quietly. "And then you came," she whispered. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't wonder if I had powers. You just sat, and prayed with me. In that moment I knew the curse would soon break." Ahmed bowed his head. "Not from guilt, but reverence. I don't know what made you trust someone like me." Neelam squeezed his hand gently. "Because I already knew you." Ahmed looked up. "In a past life, who was I? No one. Just a boy who once passed by the mosque my father cleaned. You gave me a piece of bread when I fainted from hunger, and walked away without saying a word." Ahmed was stunned. Old memories surged like waves against long-forgotten cliffs. A winter afternoon. A girl collapsed near the mosque steps. A piece of bread, broken in half. "What did you say then?" I said, "If someone I don't know can share the last thing they own, then I believe in this life or the next I will find that person again." Silence. Only the sputtering oil lamp crackled like quiet tears. Ahmed no longer doubted. This wasn't just a story of a boy and a bird. This was the story of an unspoken promise kept whole across 2 lifetimes. 3 days after the wedding, the quiet village began to feel strange. The old dog at the village gate howled at night like a soul lost in shadow. Oil lamps hanging from porches flickered out at midnight. No wind, no rain. And most chilling of all, a flock of black crows circled the treetops at the edge of Ganesha Forest, a place no one dared approach since Neelam had been freed. Ahmed's father understood immediately. He summoned the couple, his voice deeper than ever. "There is a disturbance in the ether. It's not fever. Not wind. It is the aftershock of awakened malice." Neelam nodded. Her eyes no longer trembled like before. Now they carried resolve like one who knew the greatest battle had yet to come. "He knows I'm free," she said softly. "The sorcerer." Ahmed clenched his fists. "He's not just a man. He's a form given to karma itself. He doesn't need a reason to return, just the knowledge that light once slipped from his grip." That night, while the entire village lay asleep, a thin veil of smoke drifted lazily through the courtyard of Ahmed's home. At first, it smelled of sandalwood. Then came the stench of dried blood. Neelam stepped onto the porch. She wore a white robe and a black scarf wrapped around her head. In her hand was a string of prayer beads, not for protection, but as a reminder that she was still awake in spirit. And he appeared. Not from anywhere. As if he had always been there, only waiting to be named. He stood beneath the old tamarind tree at the edge of the yard. Tall. Heavy. Eyes bulging and red, like strips of dried meat under a cruel sun. In his hand was a talisman, red string twisted into a cursed loop. His mouth curled into that same smile that had once almost cost Neelam her entire existence. "You think you've escaped?" Neelam didn't answer. "I don't care if you're bird or woman. I just want you to kneel. Like so many before you have." That voice again. The one that could bury every good memory with a single cursed word. But this time Neelam did not bow. "If you remember," she said quietly, "I am a Hafiz of the Quran. I kneel for no one but God." He snarled and pulled a black stone from his cloak. "Then let's see, if your Allah can protect you now." He began chanting dark verses. The smoke turned from gray to black, then red. Threads as thin as razors spun through the air, shaping into eyeless orbs that floated, staring, in the night. Neelam closed her eyes and began to recite. Not loudly. Not quickly. Each verse was deliberate, each word a step on a staircase lifting her soul above the chasm of evil. Ahmed burst out from the house. He saw the scene and lunged toward Neelam, but his father grabbed his arm. "This isn't a battle of bodies. But what if something happens to her? If you truly wish to save her, then stay silent. And pray." The smoke began to wail like the cries of 100 bound souls struggling in fire. Still, Neelam did not falter. She reached Surah Al-Falaq, the verses taught to repel darkness, sorcery, and the unseen horrors of night. With every word she spoke, one of the smoky, sightless eyes exploded like glass meeting fire. The sorcerer shrieked. His hand trembled. The black stone glowed red-hot, then burst with a pop and blood streamed from his palm. "You! How dare you!" he screamed. And vanished into the smoke. Not dissolved. Dragged. As if an unseen force had yanked him back into the abyss he once ruled. Silence returned to the courtyard. Neelam stood in the center of the scorched circle, sweat trickling down her brow, but her eyes glowed as though she had just been reborn. Ahmed ran to her, embracing her tightly. "I was afraid." Neelam shook her head. "I was too. But not for me." "Then, for whom?" "For him. Because next time he comes back, I may not only use prayers." From the shadows, the old father watched and whispered. "Karma has not ended. But the fire in your hearts is enough to warm 3 lifetimes." 2 days after the confrontation, the village was no longer calm. The wind blew in reverse. The village well, once never dry, began to bubble with the stench of diluted blood. A sparrow was found dead in the temple courtyard, eyes wide open, blood dripping from its beak, a red triangle marked on its forehead. The first child fell ill by noon on the 3rd day. A 5-year-old girl. Her skin bubbled with black sores, her eyes lost all white. The father ran, desperate, to seek help, but when he reached the village gate, his body froze like stone. His eyes stayed wide like a forgotten statue of some ancient forest god. The old ascetic understood. This is no longer personal vengeance. This is a wide cast soul curse. The one who cast it traded his own flesh, but in return, he casts a shadow over the land. He opened a worn Buddhist scripture, flipping to a yellowed page, and read aloud in a hushed voice. The soul siphon curse, a spell of unraveling. With each soul lost, the caster absorbs its essence into their own heart. To break the spell, a living being must willingly offer their life to release all others. No harm. No coercion. It must be a choice, made by a pure heart. Neelam sat in silence. Ahmed stood up. I'll go. Both turned to him. I'll be the one to offer my life. Let it end here. The old man did not look surprised. He only sighed, eyes as still as river stones. You think I've never offered my own life for someone else? But now, it's my turn. If one life can save an entire village, the children, then why not mine? Neelam grabbed Ahmed's hand tightly. No. If someone must die, it should be me. No. You've only just returned. You've just started living again. Neelam looked into his eyes, hers burning with a light that came from more than this lifetime. And that's why I know the price of not being allowed to live. I was once turned into a bird. Stripped of my right to love. Robbed of my voice. I lived in silence. But now, if that silence can become a warning bell for an entire village, then I choose it again, in death. Her words were a blade sharp, clean, cutting straight into Ahmed's heart. He pulled her close and whispered, I won't allow it. This isn't about your permission. This is my karma. And, it is a vow I carried from a life before this one. Before the sun rose, they left the village. Atop the hill, where the first light always kissed the grass, Ahmed and Neelam stood face to face with the sorcerer. He was thinner than before. His eyes, hollowed and sunken, burned brighter than the waning moon. In his hand was an ancient book of curses, each page bleeding slow, steady drops of blood. I knew you would come, he said. And we knew, Neelam replied, that you never truly wanted to kill anyone. You just didn't want to be forgotten. He let out a bitter laugh, then coughed, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth. You think I did all this for fame? No, Neelam said gently. Because once, you loved. And were rejected. Her words drained the color from his face. His rage died like a storm that lost its wind. He sank to the ground and whispered. I had a sister. She was a Hafiz of the Quran, like you. I admired her. But, she fell in love with a Muslim man. A good man. And left the faith. So, you killed her. He shook his head. Tears fell. No, I cursed myself. And, everything that carried light. Neelam stepped forward. If it takes a soul to restore the light to everyone else, then take mine. Neelam. Ahmed screamed, but it was too late. She stood before the sorcerer, hands folded. No fear. No blame. Only acceptance. The sorcerer raised a dagger carved from human bone. But, his hands trembled. And he fell to his knees. No, I can't. You're not like my sister. You don't hate me. I can't take the life of someone who still has mercy for me. Then, like a tree that had borne too much sorrow, he broke down and wept. The smoke lifted. The trapped souls were freed. The little girl in the village opened her eyes. The dead sparrow flew again. And light poured down the hillside like a rain of forgiveness. 3 days later, the sorcerer burned himself in a ritual of atonement, led by Ahmed and Neelam. No one cursed him. Because a man once consumed by shadow who learns to kneel has already taken his first step out of the cycle of suffering. They say that after a storm, the earth blooms. But in that village once covered in darkness, flowers did not bloom right away. Only ash. The children who awoke remembered nothing of the black fog that had passed. The adults moved quietly, gathering broken branches, thatching rooftops with silent hands. The entire village felt like a body waking after a long fever, pulse faint, eyes open, but the heart still adrift. Only 3 people refused to rest: Ahmed, Neelam, and the old ascetic. They didn't preach. They didn't speak of miracles. They didn't mention the sorcerer. They worked. 1 brick. 1 reed stalk. 1 bowl of porridge for the weak and hungry each morning. To help people believe in light again, the father said, "Don't carry a torch. Build a hearth." The first to follow them was a young orphan named Rafiq, the boy who had first fallen ill. "I don't remember much," he said. "Only a voice, chanting light into my ears." And from Rafiq, others emerged from their shadows. A girl once in a coma began relearning how to write. A young man who once trembled before nightfall now lit oil lamps outside every doorway. And soon, a small group gathered each dawn by the village well, listening as the old man chanted verses not to banish demons, but to remind them, "Don't forget the light we once held." One day, Rafiq asked, "Master, why don't we call this place the Reborn village?" Ahmed smiled. Neelam answered, "Because if we call it that, we'll always remember we once died. But if we call it the village of gratitude, we'll remember that we are still alive." And so the name spread, the village of gratitude. People from other villages began to visit. Some came for medicine. Others came to stay for a night, saying, "The nights here feel cool and calm, like someone is praying on our behalf." Ahmed and Neelam rebuilt the little hut at the forest's edge, the place where she had once been imprisoned. But this time, it wasn't a prison. They opened a chamber of silence and stillness, a place where anyone could come, sit quietly, no talking, no judgment, no expectation. The old came to cry. The young came to sleep. Some simply sat, watching the light slant through the bamboo wall, and whispered to themselves, "If a bird can be forgiven, why not me?" One night, while Ahmed was lighting oil lamps along the village well, Neelam came to him holding a piece of deep blue cloth embroidered with a sky pattern. "I think this place needs a symbol," she said. "A symbol of what?" he asked. "Of a new beginning. One that doesn't depend on miracles or rescue. Just the decision to stop turning away from the light." They hung the cloth in the center of the temple courtyard. The next morning, the villagers gathered around. And strangely, no one asked what it meant. They just stood in silence, smiled, and began lighting morning fires with hands lighter than usual. The old man watched as 3 children sat drawing under a tree, charcoal staining their fingers. Rafiq was retelling the story of the bird and the boy in the forest. But this time, he told it differently. The bird wasn't the one being saved. She was the one doing the saving. And the old man nodded. "That's right. And the boy, he wasn't a hero. He was just someone who didn't look away when the light came in a strange form." That spring arrived late. Rain still lingered into March, and the new leaves that sprouted weren't as vibrant as in years past. They looked pale, as if drawn by the trembling hands of an old painter. But no one in the village seemed to mind. Because in the bamboo-roofed house at the village center, once a shelter for fear, a new life was quietly growing in the womb of the woman once called a bird. Neelam was pregnant. No one said it out loud. No one shouted congratulations. But every smile grew softer, and every morning's porridge carried a hint more ginger and clove. That was enough. Everyone understood, the old light was returning in a new form. Ahmed had changed. He no longer kept to silence. Nor did he speak like a leader. He simply began to tell stories, tiny tales about how the gray bird used to make tea with dry mint leaves, or bake bread from flour brought by mice from deep in the forest. The children laughed, their eyes sparkling. One even drew that story on the village temple wall, scribbling beneath it in uneven letters. "This is the mother of courage." One afternoon, just after the rain, a stranger came to the village. He was old, clothed in a long brown robe, hair as white as smoke. On his back, he carried a short stringless lute. No one knew where he came from. But he walked through the village, paused at Ahmed's gate, and said to the old father, "I passed places that were once dens of shadow. But here, I smell stillness. May I rest for a night?" The old man invited him in without a single question. That evening, after a quiet meal of porridge, the stranger tapped gently on his stringless instrument. And he began to sing, not with voice, but with breath. Not sound, but the vibration of peace, resonating straight into the hearts of those who listened. Then he spoke. Far in the east, there was a village once cursed by the one who sowed darkness. But a bird who knew scripture broke the curse not with magic, but with faith. They say, when light is distorted but still carries the call of the heart, that is the path for souls to escape the will of suffering. Everyone fell silent. Only the old father raised his head, eyes narrowing toward the stranger. "Who are you, really?" The man smiled softly. "I am no one. Just someone who keeps a promise." "What promise?" He stood and walked to Neelam, who sat beneath the oil lamp. He gently placed a hand upon her belly. "I promised a soul, that if it chose to live again, I would find it, and give it a new name." Everyone stood in awe. Tears welled in Neelam's eyes. "You saw my child before she was born. I saw her in the form of a bird's wing. Then in the eyes of a boy who knew no fear. And now in this peaceful rhythm beneath my palm." He placed his ear against her stomach and exhaled. "It is light reborn, for the third time." The next morning, the stranger was gone. No one saw him leave. Only a sandalwood prayer bead strand remained on the doorstep, along with a handwritten note. "When the bird sings again, name her Nur, it means light." And when the child was born, a baby girl, her eyes bright like the first crescent moon, her tiny hands folded as if in prayer, the whole village gathered around but could not speak. The old father, teary-eyed, whispered, "I once saw a bird become human. And now, I see a human become a promise." Neelam placed the baby in Ahmed's arms. He didn't cry. He simply smiled, a smile born across 2 lifetimes. And so, the story was passed on. Not to make people believe in miracles, but to remind them. Sometimes, when a branch falls in the wrong direction, it's really the only path that leads you home. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how you'll carry that into your life. Your words matter. Reading your reflections brings us strength and inspiration. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that uplift, inspire, and heal. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.